Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. In my last video on the appointment of a government after the election of a hung parliament, I said I'd do a separate one about confidence and supply agreements that support the minority government. So, here it is. In the early years of Australian Federation, particularly when political parties were not yet fully developed, minority governments were sometimes formed, and government was quite a precarious business, as a government could fall at any time upon a vote of no confidence, or even votes on other more minor matters such as the reduction of a budget by £1 or the loss of procedural control over the House. Once the two-party system did develop and solidify, government became much more stable, but it also created quite strong expectations about stability. There was a United Australia Party minority government in 1940, led by Robert Menzies, and another minority government in 2010, led by the Labor Party's Julia Gillard. And after Malcolm Turnbull lost the Prime Ministership to Scott Morrison back in 2018, the Morrison government did serve out the rest of its term in minority, having lost Turnbull's seat in a by-election and suffering a couple of other defections. Minority governments have been far more common, however, at the state level, where different ways of managing minority government have been developed. Now, there are various options. First, a political party can operate as a minority government without any agreement with members of the crossbench. It can just rely for its preservation on the existence of compatible political approaches or the self-interest of crossbenchers who may not wish to face another election so soon. Second, a political party can form a coalition with a minor party in order to form a government that controls a majority of seats. Third, a minority government can co-opt one or more of the independents to be a speaker or indeed become a minister in the government to give it sufficient numbers on the floor of the House. Or, fourth, a minority government can enter into a confidence and supply agreement with minor parties or independents, which includes promises of support on confidence and supply in exchange for some action on policy reform. Now, I'm going to focus in this video on that last option, as it has indeed become the most common approach in Australia. The two essential things that a government needs in order to be able to govern are money, which means the passage of its appropriation and supply bills, otherwise known as the budget, and to maintain the confidence, meaning the support, of a majority in the lower house. A confidence and supply agreement guarantees to the government that support and the passage of the supply bills that are necessary to govern. As I mentioned previously, such agreements are not legally binding. They're not contracts. You can't get an injunction to prevent a breach of them or seek an order for their performance. And this is because the courts in Australia, in cases like Wilkinson and Osborne or Horn and Barber, have held that members of Parliament cannot enter into binding legal contracts about how they will vote in Parliament. They cannot contract out of their duty as members to act honestly and independently in the interests of the people when voting in Parliament. Any such contract would be treated by a court as void for being contrary to public policy. Confidence and supply agreements are therefore not intended to be legally binding contracts. They are instead political agreements. They're intended to give the government something it wants, which is to reassure the public, business and the markets that there will be political stability and the government will be able to govern for its full term. They're also intended to give those who hold the balance of power something that they want too, and that is some influence over government policies and usually some structural reforms to improve government accountability and parliamentary practices and procedures. If the agreements are breached, then any consequences are political, not legal in nature. A breach may damage the reputation of the person or party in breach, or it may result in retaliatory political action. from the side that feels wronged. Compliance and breach are all matters that are carefully weighed by the parties and independents in the political balance, and the risks involved will change from time to time depending upon the circumstances. Confidence and supply agreements became common in Australia from around 1989. And this was when, in Tasmania, the field Labor opposition negotiated an agreement, which was known as the Accord, with Green independents. Now, it sets standards that many have followed since, and that's why it's worthy of attention. The foreword to the Accord notes that the Greens chose not to accept cabinet positions and instead used the Accord to gain access to and influence on a whole range of government decisions. The aims of the Accord included to maintain stable government in Tasmania, enhance the role of Parliament, and undertake certain environmental reforms. The stable government part of the Accord was to be achieved by the Green independents agreeing, 1, to support the Labor government's budget and supply bills, 2, not to support or abstain from any opposition motion of no confidence, and 3, to attend all parliamentary sittings and be present for all votes and divisions except where pairs are granted. The Accord provided for meetings between the Green independents, who were spokespersons in particular areas, and the relevant ministers and public servants. It also guaranteed pre-cabinet consultation on legislation and the ability to make policy submissions to ministers prior to cabinet decisions being made. Proposed parliamentary reforms addressed matters including parliamentary sitting times, the creation of new parliamentary committees, the establishment of a register of pecuniary interests, the public disclosure of political donations, and the abolition of subsidised liquor to ministers. Changes to parliamentary staffing and the Legislative Research Service were also agreed upon, as well as the provision of equipment, including those newfangled fax machines. In addition, there were some very specific environmental matters that were agreed upon, as the gazettal of national parks, limits on wood chip exports, no pulp mill at Wesley Vale, and World Heritage listing of certain locations. The Accord also confirmed that Labor would implement its own agenda, which was set out also in the reforms, and that included fixed 4-year terms, which in fact still haven't been achieved in Tasmania, freedom of information legislation, which was achieved, and equal opportunities legislation, which wasn't achieved in that particular government. Now, the point of mentioning all of that is to show that just because a policy is mentioned in a confidence and supply agreement doesn't necessarily mean that it will be implemented. Other things can get in the way, including obstruction in an upper house, economic constraints, and also political pressures. Promises about consultation and greater access to decision-making processes were initially given some effect in Tasmania, but government enthusiasm soon waned and Green influence also waned with it as the disputes and the bitterness grew. The Accord actually only lasted from June 1989 to the 1st of October 1990, when the Greens terminated it because the state cabinet announced that it would adopt the federal forests and forest industry strategy. The end of the Accord, however, did not bring down the government. Field did survive a no confidence motion, and the government did continue to serve, with an election being held on the 1st of February 1992. Once a government is in place, it's often not in the interests of independents to bring it down and face an election. So one lesson to be learned is that independents and minor parties have their greatest power at the beginning in a hung parliament, when the issue is which side will form government. That power often diminishes during the parliamentary term as things settle down. The final point on this Tasmanian example is that the field Labor government was punished and lost the next election, with the loss partly being attributed to unhappiness about its accord with the Greens. Such agreements can be double-edged swords. On the one hand, they do open the doorway into government, but on the other hand, they can do long-term damage to political trust amongst a party's supporters. One consequence was that the following Tasmanian election in 1996, Field, who remained the Labor leader, could have formed a government with the support again of the Greens, but this time he refused to do so. The Liberal leader, Ray Groom, had also promised prior to the election that he would only govern with a majority. Now that left everyone in a pickle because there was no majority. And here's another lesson for politicians this time. Don't go making commitments in advance about who you're going to deal with or what you're going to do if there's a hung parliament, as it's far more sensible to wait to see what actually happens and adjust to the circumstances as they arise. In this case, Groom resigned as leader of the Liberal Party and was replaced by Tony Rundle, who then formed a minority government which was sustained with the support of the Greens. This time, however, there was no formal accord or even any confidence or supply agreement. The minority Liberal government relied as much as anything upon personal antagonism between the leaders of Labor and the Greens, and it also established an openness to supporting some Green policies, and this was enough to keep it alive through the next term of government. Moving now to New South Wales, the June 1991 election there also resulted in a hung parliament. There were 99 seats in the Legislative Assembly, so at least 50 were required for victory. The incumbent Greiner Liberal National Party coalition fell one seat short, winning 49 seats. The Labor Party won 46 and the Independents won 4. Initially, the minority Liberal government relied alone on the support of a former National, Tony Windsor. But greater security was needed, as was later shown by the defection of a member of the Liberal Party and the loss of a by-election. The three other independents, John Hatton, Clover Moore and Peter MacDonald, while holding quite different political views, did reach a unified position on parliamentary reforms and government integrity. They developed a Charter of Reform which was the basis for their negotiations with the government. Eventually, the Greiner government accepted most of the independents' demands and signed the Charter. It was spurred on by a review that was being conducted of the state's AAA credit rating as a result of the political instability that arose from being a minority government. And this is one of the key reasons why governments seek confidence and supply agreements, to calm both the markets and the media and establish a sense of political stability. The Charter of Reform addressed a wide range of reforms aimed at making government more accountable and Parliament work better. They included reform of the Freedom of Information Act, greater powers and independence for the Ombudsman and the Auditor-General, whistleblower legislation, requiring the publication of exposure drafts of bills in advance for public comment, entrenching judicial independence in the Constitution, the introduction of fixed 4-year parliamentary terms, the review of parliamentary procedure and standing orders, the enhancement of parliamentary committees, a separate parliamentary appropriations bill outside the ordinary budget bills, making Parliamentary Council available to draft bills and amendments for non-government MPs, the declaration of pecuniary interests, the mandatory disclosure of the source of all donations to political parties and candidates, and referendums about fixed 4-year terms, local government elections, and citizen-initiated referendums. Again, not all of these commitments were met, but a considerable number were met, leaving a really important ongoing legacy in New South Wales. I'm conscious of this because when I worked for the New South Wales Cabinet Office some years later under a majority government, there remained a commitment by that majority government to still give effect to that charter. I was well aware of the contents of the charter, and they did actually influence government action, particularly in relation to matters concerning parliamentary accountability. One important variation in the New South Wales Charter was a condition that was placed on confidence. It committed the independents to support supply being granted to the government and not to support the opposition in any motion of no confidence, and here's the key thing, unless it related to matters of corruption or gross maladministration. And the Charter went on to say this: we reserve the right to move a motion of no confidence on any matter at any time if the government does not honour its agreement to implement the Charter of Reform in accordance with the agreed timetable, or in relation to matters of corruption or gross maladministration. It was this qualification that actually brought down the Premier, Nick Greiner, who indeed was the one who had agreed to the Charter. The Coalition had lost a seat in the House when the controversial former Education Minister, Terry Metherell, resigned from the Liberal Party. It later developed a cunning plan to offer Metherell a public service job, for which he was well qualified, in order to get him out of Parliament so that the party could win back his seat. This blew up into a major controversy, which was then inquired into by the Independent Commission Against Corruption, itself a creation of the Greiner government. The Commission made findings of corrupt conduct against both Greiner and his Environment Minister, Tim Moore. While Greiner and Moore challenged those findings in the Supreme Court, the independents took the view that their conduct had triggered the application of that qualification on confidence, and they signalled that they were prepared to support a no confidence motion in the government unless Greiner and Moore resigned. Ultimately, they did so, and they were later successful in their legal challenge against the findings of the Independent Commission Against Corruption, but by then their political careers were over. Similar conditions concerning corruption have also appeared in other confidence and supply agreements. For example, the 1999 Charter entered into by the Bracks Labor government and independents in Victoria provided that the independents would support the Bracks government on appropriation and supply bills and all motions of no confidence unless there is evidence of fraud, misappropriation or illegal activities. It also stated that the independents would withdraw their support from any government which demonstrates mismanagement or misuse of public funds, is shown to be corrupt, which supports any practices which are corrupt or which violates accepted standards of public probity, or abuses the spirit of democratic parliamentary practice and procedure. I wonder how many governments would be able to comfortably claim that they hadn't breached any of those conditions. If there is a confidence and supply agreement arising from a hung parliament at the next election, or indeed a number of such agreements, it will be very interesting to see what conditions are placed upon the agreement and whether those conditions actually bite. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and as always, I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.